Now the car and the house are mine, Brian said with a cruel smile, dragging a black suitcase up the steps of my family's house as the last guests were still leaving my father's funeral. I stood on the porch, still wearing the black suit I had bought specifically for this terrible day, watching my 35-year-old brother-in-law act as if he had just won the lottery. He hadn't even waited for us to bury Dad before showing up with his bags, claiming rights he didn't have. "What are you doing here, Brian?" I asked, my voice more controlled than I expected. Inside, a mixture of anger and disbelief boiled, but years of working as a civil engineer had taught me to remain calm even in the most tense situations. He threw his suitcase on the living room floor with a thud and stretched dramatically. Finally home. It took a while, but it was worth the wait. My name is Matt, and at 32, I never imagined I would be dealing with the blatant greed of a family member on the day of my own father's funeral. But there was Brian, my late wife Lisa's brother, acting as if the last 2 years of care I had devoted to Dad meant absolutely nothing. Lisa had died in a car accident 3 years ago, and since then Brian had shown up sporadically, always with elaborate excuses as to why he couldn't help with Dad's mounting medical bills or spend time with him. Too much work, business trips, personal problems. There was always something more important. "Brian, you can't just show up here and claim ownership of anything," I said, closing the door behind me. "Dad hasn't even been buried yet." He laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the quiet house. Matt. You've always been a little slow on the uptake, haven't you? Lisa always used to say that." He pulled a folder of documents out of his suitcase. "Look what I found in Bob's office this morning." Bob was the name Brian used for my father, never able to muster the respect to call him Mr. Turner or even by his full name, Robert. "How did you get into his office?" The question came out before I could control myself, revealing more surprise than I intended. "Lisa gave me a copy of the key years ago, remember? For emergencies." He waved the papers. "And I'm glad I kept it. Look at these little gems, mortgage documents, insurance, even the preliminary will he never updated after Lisa died." My stomach dropped. Dad had mentioned several times that he needed to update his documents after Lisa's death, but he always put it off, saying he had time. The Alzheimer's disease that had struck him in recent months certainly didn't help his memory or ability to make important decisions. "According to these documents," Brian continued, clearly savoring each word, "Lisa was the sole beneficiary of everything. And as her widower, I inherited all of her legal rights. House, car, bank account, everything." He was lying. He had to be lying. Dad may have forgotten to update his will, but surely there were other documents, other safeguards. I had lived here for the past 2 years, taking care of him, paying the medical bills, keeping the house running. If you're enjoying discovering how some people's greed knows no bounds, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see how this story of family betrayal unfolds. But as Brian organized his papers on the dining room table where my father and I had breakfast every morning, I kept my expression neutral. He didn't realize that I had suspected something like this for weeks, ever since I discovered that someone had been rummaging through Dad's office during his hospital stays. And what Brian definitely didn't know was that I had spent the last few months preparing for this very moment. Brian spread the documents across the table like a poker player showing off a winning hand. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a life insurance policy dated 4 years ago. "Lisa named me as the secondary beneficiary here too. And here," he turned to another page, "the power of attorney she signed giving me legal rights if anything happened to Bob." I forced myself to keep my breathing steady as I examined the papers. Brian had planned this years ago. It wasn't last-minute opportunism, it was a carefully orchestrated strategy. "Funny how you never mentioned these documents when Lisa died," I remarked, picking up the insurance policy. Her signature looked genuine, but the date bothered me. Lisa had mentioned updating her documents after our wedding, but she died 3 months later. "It wasn't relevant at the time," Brian replied with a shrug. "Lisa was still alive, Bob was healthy. Who could have predicted he would develop Alzheimer's so quickly?" The coldness in his voice hit me like a punch in the stomach. Dad had been battling dementia for almost a year, losing pieces of himself every day. I had been there for every doctor's appointment, every test, every moment of confusion and fear. Brian had only shown up twice during the entire illness, always with excuses about important meetings or business trips. "Where were you when he forgot my name for the first time?" I asked, anger finally leaking through my controlled voice. or when he got lost in his own backyard for 2 hours. Brian didn't look up from his papers. Work is work, Matt. Someone had to keep the family going financially. You always had the freedom to play nurse because I was supporting Lisa while you guys lived here for free. The lie was so blatant that I almost laughed. Brian works as a used car salesman and lives in a rented apartment across town. Lisa had her own job as a teacher and never depended on him financially. Besides, Dad had insisted that we not pay rent, saying the house was too big for him alone. Supporting Lisa? I repeated. Brian, she made more in a month as a teacher than you did in a quarter selling cars. He finally looked at me, and for the first time I saw a crack in his confident facade. Well, that's in the past now, isn't it? The important thing is that these documents are legal and valid. Lisa was Bob's only child, which means I inherited all of her rights. I got up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden that Dad and I had tended together for the past 2 years. The roses we planted last spring were blooming, just as he had hoped they would. He didn't live to see them fully open. You know what's interesting about these documents, Brian? I said, keeping my back to him. The date on this insurance policy. 3 days before Lisa died. The silence behind me stretched long enough for me to know I had hit on something important. So what? He finally replied, but his voice had lost some of its previous arrogance. Lisa was planning to update all her documents the following week. She had scheduled an appointment with a family lawyer for after our wedding anniversary. Why would she make such a drastic change 3 days before meeting with a lawyer? I turned to face him. Brian was gathering the papers with slightly more hurried movements than before. Maybe she wanted to protect the family, he muttered. Protect them from whom, Brian? From me? From her husband. The irony of the situation was not lost on me. While Brian was trying to claim rights to the house based on suspicious documents, he didn't know that I had spent the last 6 months preparing for exactly this scenario. Brian's frequent visits during Dad's hospital stays, always with excuses to be alone in the office, organizing important papers, had not gone unnoticed. I had installed a small security camera in the office after finding drawers ransacked and documents out of place. The recordings were enlightening. Matt, Brian said, taking a more conciliatory tone, I know this is difficult. We just buried Bob. But look, it doesn't have to be complicated. You can stay here as a tenant. I'll charge you fair rent, well below market rate. Tenant. In the house where I grew up. In the house where I cared for my father during his final years while Brian was too busy to help. How generous of you, I replied. Brian smiled, interpreting my response as acceptance. Exactly. I see you're being reasonable. We can make the transition smooth for everyone. He didn't notice the sarcasm. Nor did he realize that I had already contacted the family lawyer the week before, or that the security footage showed him forging signatures on the documents he now so proudly displayed. What Brian definitely didn't know was that Dad, in one of his lucid moments 3 months ago, had called me in for a serious talk about exactly this possibility. And he had taken steps. But for now, I would let Brian savor his imaginary victory for a few more hours. After all, the fall would be much more satisfying when he realized how far he had gone with his charade. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of furniture being dragged around the house. I went downstairs still in my pajamas and found Brian directing 2 unknown men who were carrying the living room furniture to a van parked in the driveway. What the hell are you doing? I asked, my voice louder than I intended. Brian didn't even look up from the clipboard he was holding. Organizing things. Some of this furniture is too old for my taste. I'm going to sell it and use the money to modernize the place. I watched in shock as they carried out the sofa where Dad used to sit and watch baseball games, the coffee table that had belonged to my grandmother, the bookcase he had built with his own hands when Lisa and I were children. You can't sell Dad's furniture, I said, blocking the path of one of the men carrying his favorite armchair. Yes, I can, Brian replied, finally looking at me. Technically, it's all mine now. Look, Matt, I know it's hard to accept change, but you're going to have to adapt. This is my house now. One of the men, a burly guy with tattoos on his arms, pushed me lightly aside. Excuse me, man. Just doing my job. I felt something break inside me. It wasn't just anger, it was a cold, calculated clarity I hadn't felt in years. This man was literally selling my father's memory for money. Brian, Stop this right now, I said, keeping my voice controlled despite the fire burning in my chest. Or what? He laughed. Call the police? Tell them about the legal documents I showed you yesterday. See what they say. That's when Susan Matthews appeared at the front door. Susan had been our neighbor for over 20 years, a 65-year-old woman who had been a close friend of Dad's and always brought homemade pies when he was sick. Matt dear, what's going on here? She asked, watching the men carrying furniture. I thought I heard raised voices. Susan, Brian interjected before I could answer, I'm glad you're here. I wanted to talk to you. I'll be doing some renovations on the property. There may be some noise over the next few weeks. Susan looked at me with confusion. Renovations? Matt, I thought you were going to stay at your father's house for a while. A slight change of plans, Brian said, placing his hand possessively on my shoulder. Matt will be staying as a tenant, but I've taken over the property. I'm his brother-in-law, Brian. We haven't been formally introduced. I could see suspicion cross Susan's face. She had known our family for decades and knew something wasn't right. Matt, she said softly, your father never mentioned anything about leaving the house to Brian. It's complicated, Mrs. Matthews, I murmured, still watching the men systematically destroy the living room. Actually, Brian interrupted again, the will was a little outdated. Fortunately, Lisa had set up some backup documents that cover the situation. All very legal and correct. Susan narrowed her eyes. Lisa? But she died 3 years ago. Exactly. But as her brother and only living relative, I inherited all of her rights to Robert's estate. It was the first time I'd ever heard Brian call Dad by his full name. He usually didn't even show that basic level of respect. Susan looked at me again, clearly waiting for me to clarify the situation. But something stopped me from telling the whole truth at that moment. Maybe it was the instinct not to show all my cards while I was still figuring out the game Brian was playing. It's temporary, I finally said. We're still working out some legal details. The relief on Susan's face was visible, but I could tell she wasn't completely convinced. After the men finished and Susan returned to her home, Brian stretched dramatically in the now nearly empty room. Much better, he said. This place was cluttered with junk. Now I can really do something with the space. Where am I going to sleep? I asked. They took the couch. Oh, about that, Brian said casually. I ordered some twin beds for the basement. I thought it would be a good place for you. More privacy, you know. The basement. He wanted to send me to the basement like I was a troubled teenager. Brian, the basement doesn't have proper heating. And it floods when it rains hard. There's room for an electric heater. And as for the flooding, well, maybe it's time you found your own place. I can't carry on with problem tenants forever. Problem tenants. I had taken care of Dad for 2 years, kept the house running, paid all the medical bills that my insurance didn't cover. And now I was a problem tenant. That afternoon, Brian went out to take care of some business, leaving me alone in the strangely empty house. That's when I made my first important phone call. Williams and Associates Law Office, Jennifer speaking. Hello, I'd like to speak to Mr. Williams. It's about Robert Turner's will. One moment, please. Richard Williams had been our family lawyer for over 15 years. He had known Dad since before Lisa was born and had helped with various documents over the years. Matt. His voice sounded genuinely concerned. My condolences on the loss of your father. He was an extraordinary man. Thank you, Mr. Williams. I need to ask you some questions about Dad's documents. A complicated situation has arisen. I quickly explained about Brian, the documents he was presenting, and the claims of inheritance rights through Lisa. The silence on the other end of the line lasted for almost a minute. Matt, Mr. Williams finally said, there are a few things you need to know. Your father came to see me 3 months ago. He was concerned about exactly this possibility. My heart leapt. What did he say? He said Brian had been asking questions about the will and property documents. Robert was, let's say, suspicious of the motives. He asked for my help to ensure that you were protected. And we made some important updates to his documents. Updates that Brian is apparently unaware of. For the first time in 2 days, I smiled genuinely. Can I stop by your office tomorrow morning? Of course. And Matt? Bring any documentation Brian showed you. I have a feeling we'll discover some interesting inconsistencies. After hanging up, I sat in the empty kitchen looking out the window at the garden Dad and I had tended together. The roses we planted were blooming just as he had predicted. Brian thought he had one. He thought Dad had been careless with his paperwork, that the disease had made everything confusing and disorganized. But Dad had always been a meticulous man. And in his last lucid months, he had been especially careful about protecting what really mattered. When Brian returned that night with pizza and an even more arrogant attitude, I just smiled and said I was fine with a temporary arrangement. He didn't need to know that temporary meant only until I had all the evidence organized. What Brian definitely didn't know was that Dad had installed a complete security system in the house 6 months before he died, including cameras in the office where Brian had been organizing documents during his hospital stays. And the recordings of Brian forging signatures on the documents he now so proudly displayed would be very interesting for Mr. Williams to review. The next morning, I arrived at Mr. Williams' office at 8 o'clock sharp, carrying a folder with all the copies of the documents Brian had shown me. The lawyer was already waiting for me with coffee and a serious expression that told me the news would be interesting. "Matt, your father really took pains to protect you," Mr. Williams said, opening a thick folder. 3 months ago, when he came here, he was extremely lucid and determined. He said Brian had been asking strange questions about inheritance and property rights. He placed a series of documents on the table in front of me. First, we completely updated the will. You are the sole beneficiary of everything: house, car, bank accounts, even the small inheritance Lisa had left to your father. My heart raced. Lisa left something to Dad? $5,000 and some of her family jewelry. Nothing substantial, but legally it would have passed to Brian as her widower, if it weren't for the fact that Robert formally donated everything to a charity in her memory. We signed the papers that same day. Mr. Williams turned to the next page. But here's the most interesting part. Your father also created a revocable power of attorney that automatically nullifies any previous documents signed by Lisa that named third parties as beneficiaries of property she never owned. I didn't fully understand the legal implications, but I realized that Dad had anticipated exactly what Brian was trying to do. "Now," Mr. Williams said, adjusting his glasses, "show me the documents Brian presented." I spread the copies out on the table. Mr. Williams examined them carefully with a magnifying glass, jotting down details in a notepad. "These are extremely interesting," he murmured after 15 minutes of silent analysis. "This signature here, and this date. Matt, these documents have clearly been forged." "Are you sure?" "Absolutely. Look here," he pointed to the insurance policy. "This signature of Lisa's was clearly copied from another document. You can see where the ink was applied differently, and there are small tremors that indicate someone was trying to reproduce natural hand movements." He continued his analysis. "Furthermore, this date is impossible. Lisa supposedly signed this 3 days before she died, but in our files we have records that she was hospitalized for that entire week due to the accident. There was no way she could have signed anything." A cold anger spread through my chest. Brian had not only tried to steal Dad's inheritance, but he had forged his own dead sister's signature to do it. "Mr. Williams, this is a federal crime, isn't it? Forgery of legal documents, insurance fraud, attempted theft of property." "Yes, Matt. Brian has committed several serious crimes. The question is, what do you want to do about it?" I thought for a moment. "I want him to pay for everything. But I want to do it the right way. If this story of family betrayal is tugging at your heartstrings, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how this carefully planned revenge unfolds." Mr. Williams smiled for the first time that morning. "Then we have work to do. First, I'll contact a private investigator who works with me on fraud cases. We need to document everything Brian has done in the last few weeks." "I already have something that might help," I said, remembering the security recordings. "Dad installed cameras in the office 6 months ago. I have recordings of Brian tampering with documents during hospital admissions." Mr. Williams' eyes lit up. "That's crucial evidence. We'll need certified copies of those recordings." We spent the next 2 hours planning our strategy. Mr. Williams would contact the appropriate authorities to report the fraud, while I compiled all the evidence I had collected. "One important thing, Matt," Mr. Williams said as I was leaving. Don't confront Brian directly about this yet. We want him to keep thinking he's winning while we build our case. I returned home to find Brian installing a new giant screen television in the now empty living room. It was at least twice the size of Dad's old TV. "What do you think?" he asked proudly. 70 inches. Paid cash. "With what money?" I asked, feigning casual curiosity. "Well, I sold some of Bob's old furniture and had some spare change saved up. I thought it would be a good way to modernize the place." He was lying through his teeth. I had seen the furniture being carried away for free by the men in the van. They obviously hadn't paid anything for it. "Oh, and Matt," Brian continued, "I'm going to need you to move to the basement by the end of the week. I have a friend coming to stay in your room for a while." "What friend?" "Derek, you don't know him. We're setting up a business together. He needs a place to stay temporarily." Derek. I knew that name from the phone calls Brian made when he thought I wasn't listening. Derek was apparently his partner in some shady scheme involving reselling recently acquired properties. That night, after Brian left for a business dinner, I called the private investigator Mr. Williams had recommended. "Marcus Investigations, Jake speaking." "Mr. Jake," Mr. Williams referred me. "I need help with a family fraud case." "Sure. I can be at your house in an hour to discuss the details." Jake arrived on time, a 50-year-old man with gray hair and the air of someone who had seen it all. I explained the situation while he took detailed notes. "Interesting," he said after hearing the whole story. "And you said he has a partner named Derek?" "Yes. From what I've heard from phone conversations, they're involved in some kind of real estate business." Jake smiled in a way that made me feel there was more to the story than I realized. "Matt, Derek Lawson is a well-known figure in our circles. He has an extensive history of real estate fraud and document forgery schemes. If Brian is working with him, this isn't just about his father's house." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "It means there are probably other victims. Other widows, other orphans they've exploited in the same way. Brian may have done this before." Jake stood up and walked to the window. "With your permission, I'd like to expand the investigation. Not just to protect you, but to find out how many other families they may have harmed." "Do it," I said without hesitation. "There's one more thing," Jake said, turning to face me. "If Derek is coming to stay here, it means they're probably planning something big. Maybe using this house as a base for other schemes." The realization hit me like a train. They didn't just want to steal Dad's inheritance. They wanted to use our family home as a center of operations to defraud other families. "Jake, I need you to find out everything you can about this Derek guy. And I need to know exactly what they're planning." "I'm already on it." "And Matt? Keep this conversation between us for now. If Brian suspects we know about Derek, they might just disappear and start over somewhere else." After Jake left, I sat in the empty kitchen looking out the window at Dad's garden. The roses were blooming just as he had planned, but now I discovered that our home was being used as a platform for crimes that could have destroyed dozens of other families. Brian came home at 2 in the morning, clearly drunk and talking loudly on the phone. "Yes, Derek, everything is working perfectly. That idiot Matt doesn't suspect a thing. By the end of the week, we'll have complete control of the property and can begin the next phase." I heard every word through the thin floor between the kitchen and the living room. "No, he won't be a problem. He's too passive, too emotional about his father's death. He won't even question it when Derek moves in here." Next phase. Total control. The pieces were falling into place in an even more sinister way than I had imagined. But as Brian celebrated his early victory, he didn't know that every word he had said was being recorded by the security system Dad had installed. He didn't know that Jake was already investigating Derek Lawson. And he definitely didn't know that Mr. Williams was preparing a criminal case that could put them both behind bars for decades. Brian thought he had played his final cards and won the game. In reality, he had just given me all the evidence I needed to destroy not only his plans, but the entire criminal operation he was a part of. For the first time since Dad's funeral, I smiled genuinely. The real game was just beginning, and Brian was about to discover that he had completely underestimated his opponent. Derek arrived on Thursday afternoon driving a black Cadillac and acting like he owned the whole block. He was a 45-year-old man with greasy hair slicked back, an expensive but ill-fitting suit, and the kind of smile that made me want to check if my wallet was still in my pocket. "So you're the famous Matt," he said, extending a hand with gold rings. "Brian told me a lot about you. He said you're the kind of guy who doesn't cause trouble." "I try to keep things simple," I replied, shaking his hand briefly. Derek laughed too loudly. "I like that. Simple is good. It means less complications when we get down to serious business." I watched Brian show Derek around the house as if it were a property tour, pointing out improvements he intended to make, discussing the potential of each room. Derek took notes in a leather notebook, occasionally taking pictures with an expensive phone. "This room would be perfect for meetings," Derek said, photographing the empty living room. "Good lighting, multiple exits. Professional but discreet. Meetings." I could already imagine what kind of meetings they planned to hold in the room where Dad used to watch baseball games. That night, after they settled into the guest room, my old room, I called Jake. "Derek's here," I whispered into the phone in the basement. "They're planning to use the house as some kind of operations center." "Perfect," Jake replied. "Actually, this speeds up our schedule. I have excellent news. We've gained access to Derek's bank records. This guy has at least 12 documented victims in the last 2 years. Elderly widows, orphans, grieving families. Always the same pattern." My blood boiled. How many families have they destroyed? Many. But here's the interesting part. Derek has never been caught because he always leaves the area before the victims realize what has happened. He counts on the fact that people in mourning rarely have the energy to fight back. But this time is different. Completely different. And there's more. We've managed to intercept some of their communications. They're planning to use your house for a major scheme involving at least 6 other properties in the area. We're talking millions of dollars in fraud. On Friday morning, Brian and Derek left early to take care of business. As soon as the house was empty, Jake arrived with 2 technicians disguised as phone company workers. "We're going to install additional recording equipment," Jake explained. "If they're planning to coordinate criminal operations from this house, we want every word documented." The technicians worked quickly, installing nearly invisible microphones in the living room, kitchen, and office. Within 2 hours, the house was completely monitored. "Matt," Jake said before leaving, "tonight could be interesting. Our informants say Derek is planning a big meeting. Several of his partners from the area." Partners. Other criminals like Brian. People he recruits in different cities to run the schemes locally. That night, cars began arriving at our driveway at 8 o'clock. I recognized some faces, people who had shown up at Dad's funeral, offering condolences, and asking about my plans for the future. From the basement, I could hear muffled voices coming from the living room. I crept quietly up to the kitchen and found a position where I could hear clearly through the half-open door. "Gentlemen," Derek's voice dominated the conversation, "welcome to our new center of operations. Thanks to Brian's exceptional work, we now have a perfect base from which to expand our business in the region." Polite applause echoed through the room. "As you know," Derek continued, "the model is simple. We identify vulnerable families, especially after deaths or tragedies. We establish personal connections through relatives or acquaintances. And then we use creative documentation to transfer valuable properties." My stomach churned. They were openly discussing how to exploit grieving families. "The current case demonstrates our efficiency," Brian's voice joined in. "Total control of a property valued at $400,000 in less than a week after the funeral. And best of all, the victim is cooperating completely. He doesn't even suspect he's lost everything." Cruel laughter filled the room. I was the victim. They were bragging about how they had tricked me in my own home. "Brian's right," Derek said. "Matt is the ideal mark, emotional, passive, isolated. No lawyer of his own, no suspicions. In a month, we'll have liquidated all the assets and moved on to the next town." That's when my phone vibrated silently. A message from Jake: "Teams in position. Give the signal when you're ready." I took a deep breath. It was time. I walked calmly through the living room, pushed open the door, and entered. 12 men were sitting on plastic chairs brought in from somewhere, with Derek standing in front of them like a teacher giving a lecture on crime. The silence was instant and absolute. "Sorry to interrupt," I said with a smile, but I thought you might like to meet the passive victim in person. Brian jumped out of his chair. Matt. We were just planning how to liquidate my property assets, I added. Yes, I heard everything. Derek regained his composure more quickly than the others. Matt, you don't understand what you heard. We were discussing legitimate investments. Legitimate investments, I repeated thoughtfully. Like forging Lisa's signature on insurance documents? Or using fraudulent power of attorney to claim rights to property that never belonged to her? The color drained from Derek's face. I don't know what you're talking about. I pulled out my phone and played a clear recording of Brian in Dad's office 3 weeks earlier, practicing Lisa's signature on a sheet of paper. Interesting technique, I commented. Although the ink is different from the original, and the paper is from a batch manufactured 2 years after her death. Several of the partners began to shift nervously. One of them stood up and walked toward the door. I didn't know any of this, he muttered. I thought it was legitimate. Sit down, Derek ordered coldly. No one leaves until we sort this out. Actually, I said, I think everyone should stay right where they are. I took another phone out of my pocket and dialed a number. Special Agent Morrison, FBI. Standby is confirmed. You may proceed. Within 30 seconds, the house was filled with federal agents. Derek tried to run to the kitchen, but 2 agents were already waiting there. Brian simply collapsed into his chair, his face in his hands. Matthew Turner, an agent approached me. Yes, sir. Special Agent Morrison, FBI. Thank you for your cooperation. Your recordings have provided sufficient evidence for federal indictments for mail fraud, conspiracy, and document forgery. I watched as they handcuffed Derek, Brian, and 4 others. The rest were taken in for questioning. Brian, I called as they led him away. There's one thing you never understood about Dad. He looked up, already in tears. He always knew exactly who you were. That's why Lisa never inherited anything substantial from him while she was alive. That's why he updated his will immediately after my marriage. And that's why he installed security cameras 6 months before he died. Brian opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He once told me, I continued, Matt, some people show who they really are when they think no one is looking. Others show it when they think they've finally gotten what they wanted. You showed both. By the time the agents finished processing the scene, it was past midnight. Jake appeared at the front door with Mr. Williams in tow. How do you feel? Jake asked. I looked around the house, now free of Brian and his criminals. Free, I replied. For the first time in weeks, completely free. Mr. Williams placed a folder on the kitchen table. Matt, there's one last surprise your father left. Something he asked me to give you only after this whole situation was resolved. I opened the folder and found a handwritten letter in Dad's familiar handwriting. My dear Matt, it began, if you are reading this, it means that Brian has shown his true colors and you have managed to protect our family. I am proud of you for being strong enough to fight, but wise enough to fight the right way. The letter went on to explain that Dad had been documenting his suspicions about Brian for months, working with Mr. Williams to create a comprehensive protection plan. You were never really in danger of losing the house, the letter concluded. But it was important that Brian believed he had won enough time to fully reveal his criminal network. Thank you for having the courage to see this through to the end. Justice doesn't always come quickly, but when it does, it must be complete. When I finally went to sleep that night, in my own bed, in my own room, in my own house, I realized that Dad had taught me the most important lesson of all. Patience is not passivity, and real strength comes from knowing exactly when and how to use it. Brian thought he was playing chess, but in reality he was just a piece on the board Dad had set up months before. And now, finally, the game was over. 6 months later, I got a call from Jake informing me that Brian had been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Derek got 15 years, as he was considered the head of the operation. 12 other members of the network received sentences ranging from 3 to 10 years. The victims they identified over the past 2 years are all getting their property back, Jake told me. Your courage to fight changed the lives of at least 20 families, Matt. The legal proceedings had revealed the true extent of the criminal operation. Brian and Derek had stolen more than $2 million from bereaved families over 3 years. Elderly widows, vulnerable orphans, people at their most emotionally fragile, all exploited by the same cruel system that nearly destroyed me. Dad's house was officially registered in my name without any dispute. Mr. Williams discovered that Brian had never had any legal basis for his claims. All the documents were so amateurishly forged that it was impressive how he had managed to fool anyone. "Your father was truly a visionary man," Mr. Williams told me during our last meeting. "He anticipated every move Brian would make and created safeguards to protect you." The final letter he left proves that he knew exactly the kind of person he was dealing with. I completely reorganized the house, keeping Dad's important memories but transforming the space into something of my own. The garden we cultivated together continues to flourish. The roses are more beautiful than ever, as if they know they are finally safe. Susan Matthews, our neighbor, showed up at my door 3 weeks after the trial. "Matt, dear, I always knew there was something wrong with that Brian," she said, bringing one of her famous homemade pies. "Your father would be so proud of how you handled all this. You showed the same wisdom and strength he always had." The comment moved me more than I expected. During the difficult months of my father's illness, I sometimes wondered if I was doing everything right. Now I knew I was. I returned to my job as an engineer, but with a completely different perspective. The experience with Brian taught me about strategic patience, about the difference between reacting and responding, about how true strength sometimes means knowing when to wait for the right moment to act. 3 months after the trial, I found an envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a handwritten letter from an elderly lady named Margaret in Louisville. "Dear Mr. Turner," she wrote, "I saw your story on the news when they arrested those criminals. I wanted to thank you for having the courage to fight. Because of your bravery, I was able to get back my late husband's house that they had stolen. My grandchildren have a home again. God bless you." It was one of 12 similar letters I received that month. Entire families had gotten back their homes, their savings, their dignity, because I had decided not to accept injustice in silence. The architect I had met months earlier became a close friend. He helped me renovate my father's office, transforming it into a space where I now do volunteer work helping other families facing real estate fraud. "You have a gift for detecting lies," he told me as we installed new bookshelves. "It must be from the years you spent caring for your father. You've learned to pay attention to the details that matter." He was right. Caring for Dad during his illness taught me patience, observation, and how to recognize when something wasn't right. Those same skills saved me from Brian's trap, and now I help others protect themselves. One fall afternoon, while watering Dad's roses, I reflected on the entire journey. Brian had tried to turn me into a victim, but he inadvertently turned me into an advocate. His plan to destroy me ended up giving me purpose. The real victory wasn't seeing Brian handcuffed and taken to prison. It was realizing that by defending Dad's memory and protecting our home, I had discovered who I really am, someone who does not accept injustice, who fights for the vulnerable, and who understands the value of family and dignity. If this story of perseverance and justice has touched you, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories about people who have turned their greatest difficulties into their greatest victories. My dad always said that character is revealed in difficult times. Brian showed his true character when he thought he could exploit our grief. I showed mine when I decided to fight for justice not only for myself, but for every family he had harmed. Today, when I walk through the room where Dad slept his last months, I don't feel sadness. I feel gratitude. He prepared me for this moment without me realizing it, teaching me that true strength comes from doing what is right, even when it's difficult. The last time I heard from Brian, he was serving time in a federal prison in Texas, working in the laundry room for 60 cents an hour. I was launching the Robert Turner Program for the protection of bereaved families, offering free counseling to people facing real estate fraud. The difference between us has always been simple. He chose to exploit the pain of others for personal gain. I chose to turn my pain into protection for those in need. And that choice made all the difference.